Last year, over 2 million Americans packed their lives into moving trucks, canceled leases they'd held for a decade, pulled their kids out of schools mid-year, and drove away from cities they swore they would grow old in. 2 million. That's not a trend. That's not a blip on a census report. That is a mass rejection of places that used to define what it meant to make it in America. And here's the part that should bother you. The reasons being reported on the news are almost entirely wrong. You've heard the usual explanations. Remote work, housing costs, people wanting more space after the pandemic. And sure, those factors exist. But they're surface level. They're the symptoms people point to because the real causes are harder to talk about, and frankly, more uncomfortable. If remote work was the genuine driver, these cities would have stabilized by now. Offices have reopened. Hybrid schedules are locked in. Yet the outflows keep accelerating, year after year. Something deeper is pushing people out, and once you see the actual pattern, the thread connecting all of these cities, you can't unsee it. That's exactly what I'm going to break down in this video. City by city, with real numbers and the exposed truth behind each exodus. Some of these are going to surprise you, and one of them almost caught me personally. Let's start with the city that shocked me the most when I dug into the data, San Francisco. A decade ago, if you landed a tech job in San Francisco, you had essentially won the modern American lottery. 6-figure salaries, stock options, a city bursting with culture, innovation, and ambition. People fought to get in. Wait lists for apartments. Bidding wars on studios. The idea that anyone would voluntarily leave seemed genuinely absurd. Fast forward to today, and San Francisco has lost nearly 7% of its population since 2020. Entire neighborhoods that used to have 3-month waitlists for Lake C. A 1-bedroom now have vacancy signs collecting dust on windows. What actually broke San Francisco wasn't one dramatic event. It was a compounding failure of basic livability that built up like sediment over years. The tech companies didn't just allow remote work. Many quietly relocated operations to Austin, Miami, and Denver. But the resident exodus started before the corporate moves, and that detail matters. Property crime in certain districts rose so sharply that major retailers, not small shops, but national chains with massive loss prevention budgets, closed locations entirely. The city's approach to its homelessness crisis, regardless of where you fall politically on solutions, created a street-level reality that made daily life measurably harder for residents already paying $4,000 a month in rent. When you're spending that kind of money, and you don't feel safe walking to your car at 8 p.m., the math stops working. Nobody leaves over a single issue. They leave when 5 or 6 problems stack on top of each other, and the cost of staying outweighs the pain of starting over somewhere new. Portland, Oregon, was supposed to be the model city, the place that proved you could have affordability, culture, creativity, and progressive governance all wrapped into one livable package. People relocated from across the country specifically because Portland represented an alternative to the usual big city grind. Younger professionals, artists, entrepreneurs, they all believed in what Portland was building. What went wrong there is a cautionary tale for every mid-sized American city paying attention. Portland's population growth didn't just slow, it reversed. And the residents leaving aren't who you'd expect. It's not retirees heading to Arizona, it's young families. Couples in their early 30s with 1 or 2 kids who moved to Portland for the lifestyle and discovered that the lifestyle changed around them while they were settling in. The downtown core hollowed out faster than almost any comparable city in America. Office vacancy rates climbed past 30%. When the offices emptied, the restaurants and coffee shops and bookstores that depended on weekday foot traffic followed them into the dark. Then the sense of neighborhood community, the thing that made Portland feel like Portland, started to erode. I spoke with longtime residents who described it with this particular kind of sadness that wasn't anger, but grief. Like watching a close friend slowly become someone you don't recognize anymore. Now here's where it gets personal, because I almost moved to Chicago in 2019. I had a solid job opportunity, found an apartment in Lincoln Park, that I genuinely loved and was excited about the move. A friend who'd lived there for 12 years talked me out of it over one dinner conversation. Not because of crime statistics or winter weather, because of what he called the squeeze. Chicago is one of the most fascinating and deeply frustrating cities in this entire conversation because it operates as two completely separate realities sharing the same city name. Parts of Chicago are genuinely world-class. The food scene alone, and I don't say this lightly, justifies the city's existence. The architecture, the lakefront in summer, the neighborhoods with real identity and fierce local pride. There's a reason people love Chicago, with an intensity you don't see in other cities. But the other Chicago, the one that doesn't make the travel magazines or the Instagram reels, has been in crisis for decades. And here's the squeeze my friend warned me about. Illinois carries one of the heaviest tax burdens in the country, and it keeps climbing. Property taxes in Cook County are genuinely staggering. I looked at a modest 3-bedroom in a safe middle-class neighborhood. Nothing fancy, and the annual property tax bill was over $14,000. When you combine that tax load with a state pension crisis that virtually guarantees further increases, you get a city where middle-class families are running the numbers on restaurant napkins at dinner and arriving at the same uncomfortable conclusion. The math just doesn't work anymore. Chicago lost over 80,000 residents in recent years, and the demographic pattern skews heavily toward working families with household incomes between $60,000 and $120,000. Teachers, nurses, small business owners, first responders. The people who actually make a city function day to day. That's not a housing problem. That's a structural failure. Los Angeles, 5 straight years of population decline in a city that everyone assumed was immune because of the weather and the entertainment industry. Here's what nobody mentions about living in LA right now. The median rent crossed $2,400. Commute times in certain corridors average over an hour each direction, and that's on a good day. The wildfire insurance situation has become so severe that some homeowners in Foothill communities literally cannot obtain coverage at any price. And when you talk to people who've recently made the decision to leave, there's a recurring phrase that keeps surfacing. I was surviving, not living. That distinction matters enormously. You can survive in an expensive city for a long time. You adapt, you cut corners, you convince yourself the sunshine and the energy make up for it. But there's a psychological breaking point where you realize you're spending 90% of your energy just maintaining your position, with zero left over for actually enjoying the place you're paying a premium to live in. LA crossed that threshold for hundreds of thousands of people. The entertainment industry, which anchored so much of the city's identity and economy for a century, has itself been quietly decentralizing. Productions shooting in Georgia, New Mexico, the UK, and Australia. Post-production teams working remotely from Nashville and Boise. The gravitational pull that held LA's ecosystem together has been weakening for years. The pandemic didn't cause the problem. It just made people honest about it. New York City. The one that was supposed to be untouchable. So iconic that leaving it felt like personal failure for generations. New York lost over 500,000 residents between 2020 and 2024. Sit with that for a second. 500,000 people looked at the city that calls itself the capital of the world and decided it wasn't worth the price of admission anymore. Some moved 20 miles to New Jersey or Connecticut, technically still commuting distance, but symbolically a departure from the identity of being a New Yorker. Others left the entire Northeast region. The reasons mirror the pattern we've been tracking, but amplified by New York's sheer scale. A 1-bedroom in Manhattan averages over $4,000 a month. Groceries run 30 to 40% above the national average. And the subway, the circulatory system of the entire city, has struggled with safety and reliability concerns that chip away at quality of life in ways that are hard to measure in a spreadsheet, but impossible to ignore when you're standing on a platform at 11 p.m. Here's something most people won't say out loud because it sounds defeatist, but it's the honest truth. Money alone does not explain this exodus. If the problem were purely financial, people would just relocate to cheaper neighborhoods within the same metro areas. They're not doing that. They're leaving the cities entirely. What that tells you, if you're willing to listen, is that the social contract between residents and their cities has fundamentally fractured. People pay high taxes and steep rents with an implicit expectation that the city will deliver safety, functioning infrastructure, clean public spaces, reliable transit, decent schools, and a baseline sense of community that justifies the premium. When that exchange breaks down, loyalty evaporates shockingly fast. Faster than any city planner predicted. Detroit keeps showing up on these lists, and I almost grouped it with the others, but its story actually runs on different rails. Detroit's population decline started decades ago with deindustrialization. What's happening there now is partially a continuation of that original wound. But there's also a counter-narrative of small-scale revitalization in certain neighborhoods that deserves honest acknowledgement. The point with Detroit is that some cities are dealing with legacy damage that predates every trend we've discussed. The current exodus from other cities is layering new migration patterns on top of old ones, creating a demographic reshuffling unlike anything since the Great Migration of the early 20th century. Baltimore and St. Louis share a pattern that should be studied in every urban planning program in the country. Both were once industrial powerhouses. Both have stunning architecture and deep cultural roots. Both have experienced population loss not for years, but for decades. A slow bleed that has recently accelerated into something resembling hemorrhaging. The common thread is institutional trust. When residents stop believing their local government can or will solve fundamental problems, persistent violent crime, deteriorating infrastructure, chronically underfunded schools, they start making quiet exit plans. Not dramatically. One family at a time. And every family that leaves takes tax revenue with them, which further degrades the city's capacity to address the very problems driving people out. That's a doom loop. And once it builds momentum, reversing it requires the kind of political will and sustained investment that most local governments simply cannot deliver. Let me show you the math that completely reframed how I think about all of this. Take a family earning a combined $100,000 in one of these expensive metros. After federal and state income taxes, healthcare premiums, and housing. That eats 40% of gross income. They're left with roughly $22,000 to $28,000 for everything else. Food, transportation, childcare, savings, debt payments, emergencies, and whatever counts as fun. Now move that identical family, same jobs, same income, to a city like Boise, Raleigh, or Huntsville. Housing drops to maybe 25% of income. State tax burden lightens. That swing, that 15% difference, translates to $12,000 to $15,000 a year in recovered money. Over a decade, that's a down payment on a house, a fully funded college savings account, an emergency fund that actually provides security. That's not abstract. That's the difference between financial anxiety and financial breathing room. And breathing room changes absolutely everything about how you experience your daily life. The cities absorbing all of these departing residents have one uncomfortable thing in common, and I call it uncomfortable because it challenges some deeply held cultural assumptions. They're not necessarily the most exciting places. They're not the cities you see in films or on magazine covers. They're places like Boise, Idaho, Greenville, South Carolina, Bentonville, Arkansas, Huntsville, Alabama. What they share is something less flashy but far more durable. Functional governance, reasonable cost of living, growing job markets, and a baseline quality of life that doesn't require a six-figure income just to feel stable. That's not glamorous. But after years of chasing the prestige of famous zip codes, millions of Americans are quietly deciding that sustainable beats prestigious every single time. There's a psychological layer to this migration that rarely gets discussed: identity collapse. For decades, where you lived was a core piece of how you defined yourself. I'm a New Yorker. I'm from LA. I live in San Francisco. Those statements carried weight. They implied ambition, culture, success. When the city behind that identity stops delivering, people don't just lose a home. They lose a piece of who they thought they were. That grief is real, And it's part of why this conversation gets so emotional online. People aren't just debating real estate markets, they're defending or mourning identities. Acknowledging that makes this whole phenomenon feel less like cold economics and more like what it actually is. Millions of individual reckonings, with a story they were told about what the good life looks like. People aren't just leaving cities. They're walking away from a version of the American dream that quietly stopped functioning. The version that insisted you had to be in a major coastal metro to build a real career, cultivate a real social life, or have a real future. That narrative held up when those cities honored their end of the deal, when the infrastructure worked, when public safety was reliable, when a middle-class income could sustain an actual middle-class life. As those pillars cracked, one after another, the story stopped being true for most people. And once you realize the story isn't true, staying becomes a decision you have to actively justify to yourself every single month. Eventually, most people stop being able to. If you're watching this right now, and something in your gut is telling you to rethink where you live, here's what I'd actually do. Forget the emotional arguments flying around on both sides. Sit down this weekend and calculate your true cost of living as a percentage of your take-home income. Include everything: housing, property taxes, state income taxes, insurance, commute costs, childcare, all of it. If that number is above 55%, you are in a financial pressure zone that will eventually force a decision whether you plan for it or not. And it is always better to make that decision from a position of strategy than a position of desperation. Research 3 or 4 cities that fit your career, your family structure, and your personal values. Then visit them, not as a tourist. Spend a Wednesday there. Drive the morning commute. Walk the neighborhoods at 9 o'clock at night. Talk to someone at a local grocery store or coffee shop. The data matters, but the feeling matters just as much. Because you're not really choosing a city. You're choosing a daily life. And you deserve one that actually works for you. If this opened your eyes to a pattern you've been feeling but couldn't quite articulate, share it with someone in your life who's wrestling with the same question. These conversations are happening in living rooms and group chats all over the country right now, and the people you care about deserve access to this perspective. Hit subscribe. I've got a follow-up coming that breaks down the cities actually getting it right, and what specifically they're doing that the famous ones refuse to. I think that one's going to change how you see this whole picture.